Hi everyone and welcome to this webinar, Collaborations and Connections Between Child Support Agencies and the Domestic Violence Field, Resources to Make It Real. First, we'd like to acknowledge that this is October, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and take a moment to commemorate the lives that have been lost to domestic violence and to support the survivors and the thrivers and hope for social and emotional well-being for all as we move forward. My name is Ken Noyes, and I'm a Senior Program Specialist at the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program in the Family and Youth Services Bureau at the Administration for Children and Families in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I've been an advocate for the rights of domestic violence survivors and abused and neglected children for more than 20 years. We have great speakers today, a focused agenda, and a wonderful mix of participants from both child support agencies and domestic violence advocacy organizations at the state and local levels. We are extremely happy to hear from all of you today. Also joining me are presenters Michael Hayes from the Federal Office of Child Support Enforcement, Division of Program Innovation. Michael is charged with developing and supporting implementation of family-centered child support innovations and national child support demonstration grant projects. In that role, he leads OCSE's domestic violence policy and program development, heads up their parenting time portfolio, and manages the state access and visitation grant program. Prior to his position at OCSE, he spent 12 years in the Texas Child Support Division, where he was the Deputy Director for Family Initiatives, having provided leadership of a wide range of innovative programs for teens, young parents, military families, survivors of domestic violence, and low-income non-custodial parents. So apparently he is an overachiever and just can't do enough. Next, we have Brandi Carlson. She is the Associate Vice President of Programs at the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence and has worked with the coalition in various roles for the last 8 years. Prior to her work at FCADV, Brandi worked for a certified domestic violence center as well as a statewide home visiting program that works to prevent child maltreatment. I've worked with Brandi in numerous ways and can verify that she is amazing. And Menard is an activist who has worked on policy, practice, and research issues affecting domestic and sexual violence and sexual assault survivors since 1976. She is currently the Chief Operating Officer of the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and has also served as the Executive Director of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence and as the Co-Director of Connecticut's largest domestic violence program in the mid-70s. Anne has been around the field for a very long time, and I think we all celebrate her as a leader in the field. So first, I'd like to review the agenda for today's webinar. As you can see from slide number 2, we will provide brief overviews of the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program as well as the Child Support Program. We will identify key connections between domestic violence and child support, introduce new resources that support collaboration and promote safe access to child support, and highlight the successful collaboration that has been built in Florida between the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Miami-Dade Child Support Program. But before we get started, we'd like to do a brief poll to see who is joining us on the webinar today. So please note in the poll your primary identification or role. And if you're not able to click on that screen, just use the chat box to let us know which category you best fit in. So we're just going to take a moment to let you do that poll. And I'm looking in the chat box. I see folks from state government, from domestic violence state coalitions, state government funders, DV program frontline staff, child support program managers, wow, development staff, staff attorneys, federal agency staff, more frontline domestic violence agency staff, sexual assault services. We have got a lot of really great folks that are, we've got a paralegal child support specialist, lots of great folks to join us here today with enormous expertise, and we are thrilled that you are able to be here with us today. So today we are talking about collaborations and connections between child support and domestic violence programs and sharing resources to move us to greater connections and collaborations, resources to make it real. So a little bit about the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program. The Family Violence Prevention and Services Act was passed in 1984. It was the first federal legislation that recognized the impact of domestic violence on families and created connections to safety and support. Last year, FVPSA celebrated its 30th anniversary. Next slide, please. So why is FVPSA so important? As you can see from this slide, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and stalking are incredibly widespread and very significant problems in the United States, impacting millions. 20 people per minute are victims of physical violence by an intimate partner in the United States. The Centers for Disease Control National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey tells us that 27% of women and 12% of men have experienced sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner and have reported significant short and long-term impacts such as post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms and other significant injuries. So we have several purposes of the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, and here are the four primary ones: to assist states and tribes in their efforts to prevent domestic and dating violence, to provide immediate shelter and supportive services for victims of domestic and dating violence and their dependents. We are the principal federal funder for the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and FVPSA provides for technical assistance and training related to domestic violence and dating violence programs to states, tribes, public agencies, and community-based programs, and the public. FVPSA is primarily a formula-based program. 90% of FVPSA funding is through formula grants. 70% of the funding goes directly to states and territories, where they award based on a population, they are awarded based on a population formula and managed by state and territorial grant administrators, and then they sub-award grants to domestic violence shelters and non-residential service providers. 10% of the congressional appropriation goes to tribal grants, awarding tribes and tribal organizations, and they apply annually to receive funding. 10% of the congressional appropriation goes to statewide domestic violence coalitions, and those awards go to HHS-designated coalitions. They are described in the Family Violence Prevention Services Act. They primarily serve as information clearinghouses for their states and training and technical assistance experts, as well as working on multiple systems reform efforts across their states. They also apply annually. FVPSA touched 1.27 million clients in 2014, having funded 1,250 domestic violence shelter programs, 257 non-shelter programs, and 137 tribal domestic violence programs, reaching approximately 270 tribes. And FVPSA funds programs for all of the reasons that you see there, from safe housing to victim advocacy, safety planning, support groups, legal assistance, and multiple other areas. Almost 900,000 women were served by FVPSA-funded services, and a little over 73,000 men, plus almost 300,000 children. So there represents the significance of FVPSA funding. There are 56 state and territorial domestic violence coalitions and 56 state administrators. Here are the links to be able to check out additional resources. The National Network to End Domestic Violence has an entire listing of the state coalitions and their contact information, including their websites. And please also see the link to find out who the state administrators are in each state. FVPSA also funds an entire network of national cultural and special issue resource centers, the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. All of those are listed here with their website links. We also have, as you can see, resource centers that touch justice and criminal justice, health, domestic violence, trauma and mental health, child protection and custody. And the culturally specific resource centers serve Asian and Pacific Islander communities, African American communities, and there is a Latina network for healthy families and communities. FVPSA is also the principal federal funder of the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and in fact, it is the largest FVPSA grant. They are a primary resource offering free and confidential help for victims of domestic violence 24/7, 365. They also run the National Teen Dating Abuse Helpline, which is a collaboration with Break the Cycle, and the link for that is loveisrespect.org. We've also listed the National Sexual Assault Hotline here as a resource. And for additional information, we have listed additional resource material at the link in the bottom of the slide. So in January of this year, the FVPSA formula team went to a new structure where 4 of the program specialists assigned to the team broke up into the HHS regions. So each of the program specialists that you see named there in the blue under the map, each have the regions that are assigned to them listed there. So as we build upon these collaborations and you need to talk to someone here in the FVPSA office, please refer to this map. It will tell you who to call, and we will be more than happy to assist you just as soon as we can. So before we move further into the heart of the webinar, we want to make sure that we're all on the same page because we've got lots of folks from different specialties here on the phone, and we want to be very focused on what we're talking about when we say domestic violence. For purposes of FVPSA administration, domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behaviors that adults and adolescents use against an intimate partner. It can be physical, sexual, psychological. It can run the gamut to economic coercion, coercive control. It is also characterized by one partner's effort to control the other by using a range of tactics. One other piece that I will add to this before we move on to the next slide and the next speaker is to let everyone know that yesterday the first notice of proposed rulemaking since 1996 was published in the Federal Register that addresses the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. We have a 60-day comment period, public comment period that closes on December 14th. So the link to the Federal Register was sent to all FVPSA grantees yesterday, but for those who would like to receive that information, if you could just let us know in the chat or contact us after the webinar, we will be happy to get that information to you. So I am going to transition now and turn this over to Michael.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. And is my volume okay?
Sounds good.
Great. Perfect. So thanks again to Ken, to Ann, and also to Brandi Carlson for participating in this webinar today and putting it together. This is a really great opportunity for us to share knowledge across our 2 sets of professional kind of backgrounds. And as I set up the webinar content, I want to kind of answer 2 different questions. One, why it's important for advocates in the DV world to know about child support, and 2, why it's important for child support professionals to know about domestic violence. And so just to start off, the child support caseload is big, right? And so last year there were about a little bit over 16 million nationwide. That's nearly 1 in 4 children, 1 in 2 poor children that are touched or served by the federally funded child support program. There were $32 billion in child support collected in 2014, and 95% of that went to families. Back in 1975, when the child support program was first set up as a federal agency, it was initially set up as a cost recovery program for, at that point, AFPC. The program has changed significantly, and now 95% of what's collected goes directly to families. So thinking about economic support for survivors of domestic violence, child support can be a strong and ongoing source of economic resources for survivors. 75% of collections come from wage withholding, and in the public child support system, the enforcement that is done is essentially free, or at least very low cost, depending on the state that you're in. Another reason it's important for survivors to know about, and for advocates to know about child support, is that there are several other public programs, benefit programs, that include a child support requirement. So receipt of TANF, adult Medicaid, child care services, all of those may have, depending on how the state administers those programs, are going to have some degree of a child support requirement. So if a survivor is applying for those services, they need to know about, and advocates need to know about, the pathway to identify when it's not safe to pursue child support services. Another reason is that most parents in the public child support system appear pro se, so they're appearing without legal representation, and an important role that advocates can play is helping prepare survivors for child support court. And then finally, some states and jurisdictions also address parenting time as part of the child support program. As Ken said, I worked for 12 years in the state of Texas. Texas is one of the foremost states that addresses the parenting time as part of the child support process, and that has long-term can have long-term repercussions for survivors. And so it's really valuable for advocates to know about how their child support agency does or does not address parenting time. So just to give you, when I talk about the public child support agency, since we have a mixture of people on the line, some child support people who know this stuff, but for the domestic violence folks on the call, I just want to give you a brief overview of the public or the federally funded child support program, and that is part of called Title 4D, or Roman numeral 4-D. You might hear a child support person say Title 40, and you hear the number 40 or 40, but it's Title 4D of the Social Security Act. The funding is essentially 66% of the funding comes from the federal government, and 34% of that comes from the state. The federally funded purposes of the Title 4D program are to establish paternity for children that don't yet have a legal father, to set child support orders, to obtain child support payments, to provide access to health care coverage, and then also to connect parents to support services. And you see down here in the corner of this PowerPoint slide, you've got OCSE as one of the gears. You've got tribes, states, and counties. So in some states, the child support program is both administered and run by a state agency, and so the offices are all linked to that state agency. In some states, the program is administered at the state level, but the counties are where really the work is done, and the programs are run there. And so one of the important things for those of you who are in the domestic violence field to find out as you think about partnering with child support programs is, how is your state administered? And that's something that at OCSE we can help provide information on, so that you kind of understand, is it the county that you need to work primarily with, or is it the state that you're going to work primarily with? And it varies some state by state. So I also want to just give a little bit of the why for child support, and why child support programs need to be thinking about domestic violence. So there are a number of survivor concerns about child support services. Excuse me. And it's important to recognize this is not the whole list, but these are some of the kinds of concerns that a survivor might have when accessing child support services or being involved in the child support program. The whole idea that child support could lead to more increased contact, harassment, more abuse. There's a whole concern around address confidentiality or personal contact information, and so survivors have worked hard to stay away from an abuser. They have a legitimate fear of being involved in the child support system, making their address available. There's also the whole issue around enforcing child support, the potential for that to increase an abuser's anger and lead to retribution. And that gets at some of that whole notion that domestic violence is about power and control. And so if the state gets involved in taking an abuser, from their perspective, the abuser sees this as taking their money and giving it to the other parent, that can really trigger that retribution. And then finally, the notion that filing for child support can reconnect the survivor and an abuser in kind of a long-term, formal, and lasting way. And that's especially the case in those jurisdictions where parenting time may be addressed and there may be some order that involves parents in exchanging children and that increased contact that comes with that. There's some new research that was conducted in the state of Texas about 2 years ago that looked really specifically at domestic violence and parents in the child support program. Previously, there had been some research done on recipients of public assistance, but not specific to child support. And so this is some brand new data, and it is representative of the entire Texas child support caseload, so it's not a national sample, but it's a very large sample that really gives us some insight into the incidence of domestic violence in the child support population. And so one of the notes that came out of that was that 1 in 10 unmarried mothers who sign a paternity form at the hospital, and that's really the primary way that most unmarried parents are establishing paternity today, is they sign this form at the hospital. Well, 1 out of 10 of those mothers who sign that form report domestic violence. And that raises some important questions about how that form is supposed to be a voluntary form, and if a survivor is being coerced by an abuser to sign, it raises some serious questions for states to consider there. Another is almost 4 out of 10 mothers with child support cases report having experienced domestic violence from the other parent, and that's by the time the child is 3 years old, so almost 40%. A third of the mothers in the child support system report domestic violence as one of the reasons for ending the relationship with the other parent. And then finally, there are more than 4 out of 10 mothers who don't have a formal child support, so they're not in the child support system, and they're not receiving any informal support, report domestic violence with the other parent. And so it raises this important question: if some victims of domestic violence are opting out of child support services because either they don't believe it's safe for them or they don't know what kinds of safety measures can be taken within the child support program to provide some protections to them. So all of this brings us to the launch of a couple new resources that the Federal Office of Child Support Enforcement is putting out. One is an information memorandum that is focused on kind of the why this is important. And that information memorandum is called Safe Access to Child Support Services for Survivors of Domestic Violence, the scope of the issue. That information memorandum will be sent to all of you here on the webinar when we send out the follow-up materials. We should expect to have that early next week, so you'll get that overview. And then the second resource is really the toolkit, right, the how of partnering for safe access to child support services, and that's called Enhancing Safe Access to Child Support Services, a 4D. So again, I'm using that code language that identifies this as the public child support system. So a 4D program inventory and planning resource. And like I said, that really is this kind of roadmap. One of the things that has come up over and over again in the past year or so as I've talked with child support staff across the country is there is a strong and deep recognition of the need to provide safety-informed services in the child support program to survivors of domestic violence. So there's that recognition, but that recognition is often followed up with a question of, well, like how do we get started? right? How do we get started? And so that's what's driving these two new resources that the Federal Office of Child Support Enforcement is putting out. And so I want to give you kind of a high-level overview, a snapshot of what those resources are. And then you'll be able to, as I said, those will be distributed to everybody that's on the webinar, everybody that's signed up for the webinar, in fact, as a resource for follow-up. So the first step, I think, in any kind of partnership is or any kind of work around domestic violence and child support, is to establish a partnership between the child support program and domestic violence program, staff, coalitions. And I think of this, people often use the phrase killing two birds with one stone. I'm going to put it in a positive context. I think of this as feeding two birds with one seed. Because what this does is it builds capacity of the child support program to provide child support services for survivors. And the core purpose of the child support program is to get financial support to families who need that support, right, when their families are no longer in an intact family. And providing services to survivors is a really important part of our core purpose. The other bird that it feeds with that seed, though, is that it promotes economic stability for survivors, which can help them get away from an abusive partner or stay away from an abusive partner, right? So connecting survivors to those child support services. Remember, in FY14, $32 billion in child support was distributed, 95% of that to families. So a huge source of financial stability for survivors who are trying to move into a safe and violent-free environment. And so one of the first steps is really having a meeting, getting to know each other. And there are some key points that we highlight in the new resource for programs on collaboration. And here are the kind of what I think are the primary takeaways. One is it needs to involve key leaders from both the child support program and the DV program and coalition. So there needs to be some high-level buy-in, right, to show that this is not just a one-time thing, that there's going to be an ongoing partnership, that people are committed to doing this work together. The next step is to identify some partnership leads. So somebody within the child support agency who can kind of be the person who pays attention to details. And similarly, if it's with a DV program or with the DV coalition, that there's a lead as well. So there are these kind of single points of contact to help build communication and trust. I think it's important, another first step in this meeting is to describe the services that each of the partners provide. So to describe how child support is administered in your jurisdiction and how the services are delivered. To describe how domestic violence services and shelters and programs provide services and what roles, what are the eligibility requirements. Those kind of getting a little bit of a better understanding about each of us operates in our world. Another first kind of important part of this meeting is to identify critical issues for survivors and some potential short-term responses. So as I mentioned earlier, there needs to be a commitment to the long term on this, and the inventory that I'm going to describe in a minute will help with some of that long term. But it's important in this first convening, especially for the domestic violence professionals, to identify if there's some critical issues that they're hearing from survivors and some potential short-term responses that the child support agency could take to provide some immediate relief in those situations. I think it's important to lay out in this first meeting clear expectations and what are the constraining factors. So for instance, most domestic violence coalitions will acknowledge that they've got a lot on their plate. They're nonprofit organizations. They're not you're pretty much stretched to your limit, right? Well, similarly, many child support programs have experienced state and federal budget cuts over the last, well, certainly since the recession of 2008 and 2009. So there have been budget cuts. There's been loss of staff in the child support agency, and so it's important to recognize that neither the child support side of the equation nor the domestic violence side of the equation are particularly loaded in terms of resources right now, right? So we're going to have to fit this in within kind of our ongoing operations. And then the next and final part of that first meeting is to plan next steps and establish responsibilities. So there's some follow-up, right? So what's going to happen next? Who's going to be responsible for that follow-up? So I've mentioned this whole notion of taking inventory. And in the tool that will be distributed after the webinar, there is an inventory that has multiple questions that are, so it's not a one-size-fits-all. And so rather than saying do this, 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 and this, the inventory is designed to ask a lot of questions to help both the child support agency and the domestic violence partnership get clear on what are the range of issues that may need to be addressed. Some of them may already be taken care of, but some may need to be addressed. And so there are these, excuse me, 6 broad topic areas, and under each of these 6 broad topic areas on the inventory tool, there are multiple questions, 8, 12, 15 questions, depends on the area. But one of the areas is screening for and then promoting disclosure of domestic violence. I referenced in my earlier slide about the rates of domestic violence disclosure that was identified, so that close to 40% in the child support program. We know there's that rate of disclosure, but there's that rate of experience of domestic violence, but the rates of disclosure in the child support program are much, much lower, closer to about 8% nationally. So clearly there's work for us to do around improving disclosure that involves screening and creating an environment in which survivors see why it makes sense to disclose domestic violence. That links to this next topic, which is the Family Violence Indicator. So every state's child support program has a Family Violence Indicator in which they can flag cases that essentially keep information from being disclosed in the federal case registry. So all child support cases go into a federal case registry. This helps provide some address, security, non-disclosure, especially across state lines, but needing to have some clarity on what that policy is and what it means so that the domestic violence advocates understand what that policy is and how to explain it to parents who might need that kind of protection. Another topic area is looking at specialized case management for cases with disclosure of family violence. And so what kinds of steps have states taken, has the child support agency taken to provide either specially trained staff or different kinds of case management strategies in providing services to survivors of domestic violence? That leads directly into this whole issue of training for both child support workers and advocates. So it's important to think about training not just for child support workers to have an understanding about domestic violence, but for domestic violence advocates to have an understanding about how child support works so those advocates can help be navigators with their clients as they go through the child support system and help them be prepared for different parts of that child support system. Another area that needs to be looked at is legal practice and judicial context. And so some state child support programs are heavily judicial, some are more administrative. And so there's a series of questions in the inventory that get at legal practice and the requirements based upon for the attorneys that work in that child support program about safety in their child support orders, working with the judiciary because they may have some role in either determining address non-disclosure or supporting safe practices in the courtroom, things like separating parties in the courtroom so that the victim doesn't have to face their abuser, providing telephonic hearings, so those kinds of things. And then finally, I think it's on this slide, I can't see it, so maybe my screen's not quite right. The final is thinking about accountability in a feedback loop, and that is so that as child support programs, we can learn what's working and not working directly from survivors and advocates that are working with those survivors. So as we're taking steps to increase safety, getting feedback on that so that we can check that our efforts are meeting the needs of those families. So there really needs to be that feedback loop. So just kind of break it down in some very simple terms. I've highlighted some examples of some kind of easy first steps that child support agencies and domestic violence programs and coalitions can take after they've had this kind of first meeting, right? And getting to know each other just a little bit. There's some easy first steps that seem to show up over and over again in those states that are starting this work. So for instance, developing a DD resource and referral guides. I know most state coalitions have these kinds of referral and resource guides that describe the programs across the state. Well, getting those into the hands of child support staff so that they know which programs serve parents in their counties and their jurisdictions so they can make referrals. Another really simple one is just identifying what DV resources should be displayed in child support offices, and lobbies of those child support offices, and in the courts. And one really kind of neat idea that I've heard talked about is having that information about domestic violence in women's restrooms in child support offices, because that's a private place that somebody can actually pick up information. Another kind of first step is inviting child support staff to attend domestic violence conferences. I know most states have these kinds of DV conferences where they bring advocates together, and so reaching out and inviting child support staff either at the state level or the county level to attend those conferences and kind of start to learn more about what's happening in domestic violence world. From the child support side, providing a child support 101 to DV advocates so that they have a better understanding of how child support operates in the jurisdiction that those DV advocates are working. Another really important first step, an easy one, is review the child support application. Make sure there's some questions on there about safety and refine those questions using some guidance about those questions from the domestic violence advocates that you're working with. And then for DV advocates to attend and observe some child support hearings, especially in those judicial states, so you have a better sense of kind of like what's happening, right? What goes on in child support court. It can be very, very instructive. And one that's not on here, at least I don't see it on my slide, I thought that I put on here when I was drafting these, was for child support offices, if you do staff training, or if you're a state level, you do state level training for child support staff, invite people from the Domestic Violence Coalition to come in and provide a DV 101 training as part of those state level child support conferences. One other thing I want to highlight, and this is some guidance that the Federal Office of Child Support Enforcement recently gave, well, 2 years ago, gave to states. It's a PIQ, which stands for a Policy Information Question. Just know that this is a way that the Federal Office of Child Support gives policy guidance to states. And this was a very long, extensive policy guidance to states that was focused on partnering with other programs, but there was some very specific guidance in there around federal child support funds being used to assist with survivors accessing child support services. And so I just want to highlight some of those because I know that funding and use of funds is always a question that comes up. So, for instance, federal child support funds, those funds that get passed to states, right, for states to use to administer their child support program, can be used to provide information about family violence and to screen and make effective referrals. If you're wondering what was going to be right there in that line, right? Effective referrals is what we're talking about. Develop, produce, disseminate, present outreach and education materials and curricula about safe access to child support services, and that includes training of child support staff. So state child support programs could use some of their federal funds to fund training maybe provided by a domestic violence coalition or domestic violence experts. There's funding there to consult with community-based domestic violence experts and with experts in the field of domestic violence. There's even funding to create domestic violence units that include trained caseworkers, so that kind of specialized approach, that specialized case management for child support services. And so it's important to recognize that this is something that child support programs can spend some resources on. The key here, and this is for the domestic violence folks listening in, is that the funds have to be used in a way that helps the child support agency get a safe order for a domestic violence survivor. So they can't fund what would be traditionally thought of as domestic violence services like counseling or transportation or shelter services, but they can be used to help get survivors a safe order in the child support, whether that's paternity established, an order established, or an order enforced. So things like having DV advocates in court to be there as kind of navigators for the child support program. All those things could be allowable use of our federal child support funds. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these next few slides, but when you get the PowerPoint, you'll be able to see some examples of these, some existing resources that OCSE has that complement the new resources that will be coming out next week that you'll get as a part of participating in the webinar. So we have things like a caseworker's desk card. We've got a judicial bench card for the judicial officers. We've got some training resources that are on our website. We also have other training resources that I, in my role in the Division of Program Innovation, can provide to state. We have a basic information card for survivors about the right to be safe in getting child support information there. We have a fact sheet that focuses on collaboration between child support and domestic violence programs and the importance of that. Includes some of the lessons learned, which are listen, think creatively, and partner for the long term, and that funding does matter. All right, so those are all available on our website currently. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Brandi with the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence, who's been a really wonderful partner in working with the Miami-Dade County Child Support Program in a program that's called Parenting Time Opportunities for Children. So Brandi, I'm going to pass it off to you.
All right. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Ann and Ken. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with all of you today. I recognize that there are so many incredible partnerships out there that are forming and that have been in existence for a long time, so I really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about our partnership and what the work that we started to do in Florida. So as Michael mentioned, the Parenting Time Opportunities for Children is a grant that's funded through the Office of Child Support Enforcement. And it's a pilot program to give child support agencies grants to develop, implement, and evaluate procedures to establish parenting time orders along with new child support orders. The goal of the program is to learn more about how the child support program can safely and effectively give families opportunities to establish parenting time orders, thereby improving child well-being overall as well as child support outcomes overall. So we're privileged to be a part of this grant and this work, and really excited to be partnering with the folks that you see listed on the slide here. The Florida Department of Revenue oversees much of the child support work in Florida, and the Miami State Attorney's Office, who actually oversees the work of child support enforcement in Miami, which is pretty unique to Florida. Most of the communities do not have it through the State Attorney's Office. So they are unique in that way. And Miami, we always say, is very unique in general. There's so many very unique things about the Miami community, such as strong partnerships and diversity. So it's a really great opportunity to have these strong partnerships. We also have 2 certified domestic violence centers in Miami. In Florida overall, we have 42 certified domestic violence centers. And so 2 of those are partners on this project. And then our coalition, which is the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And we are the membership organization for all of those certified domestic violence centers. So we have, I will say that there are many, many, many more partners on this project, including Michael's office, who's the funders, and a wide range of partners that are specific to the child support side of this. But I wanted to list these specific partners as those folks who are really involved in the domestic violence component and the safety of domestic violence survivors and their children, that portion of the project. And I also would be remiss if I didn't mention Tonya Sanchez, who is the project coordinator in Miami and really the champion of this project, and the person that has been really working closely with the certified domestic violence centers in her community as well as with our coalition. And Tonya had many years of working with survivors herself, and so it was a really nice fit for her to be able to be that lead within the state attorney's office and to do this work and to bridge those partners. So early in this grant, all of these partners with the Miami State Attorney's Office driving a lot of the on the ground work, created brochures and materials that could be handed out to survivors. They placed things in waiting rooms. our coalition provided more general domestic violence related resources and posters and brochures that could be put throughout the state attorney's office, and the staff there did that. And really, we started to see people starting to ask questions about that, and that was in the initial phase of the grant when we started working on this family violence preparedness and response plan that you'll see in the slide. This plan was a requirement of the grant and was developed before the implementation of a lot of the portions of the grant. And it was a really great opportunity for us as partners to be able to sit down together and really talk through what are the safety strategies that we need to put in place, what are the things that we need to consider as we embark on this work and this partnership. So we had a lot of guidance from the Office of Child Support Enforcement about what needed to be addressed in this plan. And some of the things that we included in the plan, and this is just a very brief overview, is much larger, is an in-depth description of the training that we would offer for staff and information about the screening that we would do, how often we would screen participants, and who would conduct those screenings. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We also included how survivors would be referred to those certified domestic violence centers in the Miami community, and what are some of the documentation practices we wanted to undertake, and really with an eye on survivor safety, because Florida has very open public records laws, and so we wanted to be very careful about what information was documented and what the custodial, non-custodial parents had access to related to the domestic violence screening information and anything that came out of that, those conversations that we're having. So we also, after we developed this plan and that was finalized and approved by the Office of Child Support Enforcement, we embarked on the training for child support staff and domestic violence advocates. And the heavy focus of this grant was on training child support staff, but I will say that the domestic violence advocates and the centers that are involved in this project really had an opportunity to learn more about child support enforcement themselves and about this grant in particular, and started referring survivors that they were working with to Tonya when they had needs around child support and time sharing. So that was a really nice outcome of this partnership. So when we started doing this training, each of the staff members that are working in on this project particularly, but also all of the intake staff that we're going to be doing this domestic violence screening, which there are many, many of them in the Miami office, all of them received training on domestic violence dynamics, what to look for regarding survivors and their kids that may be in very dangerous situations. We've talked about abuser tactics, of how they try to control their family members. We also talked a lot about working with batterers in a way that doesn't put survivors in more danger. And so, we want to be really careful about those conversations that we have with abusers, that we're not feeding into or validating anything that they're saying about the survivor in a way that's putting blame on her. So we had a lot of those good conversations. We also talked about mandated reporting of child abuse when that becomes an issue, and informed consent around that, which I think was a really important discussion that we had in the training. And what I mean by that is just making sure that before you start to have these conversations, that participants, that parents understand your reporting functions and what you have to report by law in your state or your community related to child abuse or child maltreatment, and that looks different in most of our states. And so we always feel that it's very important to share that information with parents up front before we start to have those conversations. So moving on to the screening, we did a lot of training specifically around screening as well. So in that training, we talked about role plays. We practiced role plays. We talked about how to connect survivors to resources as a part of that screening. And the tool that we decided to use, and this is not a promotion of any specific screening tool, but what worked for us on this project specifically was the radar screening tool. And the reason that we decided to use that and really wanted to use the radar screening tool is it focuses just as much on the process of screening as much as on the questions. So what I mean by that is the acronym RADAR stands for routinely screening participants, or doing that on a regular basis, asking direct questions, document your findings, and in that the safety around documentation is critical to plan that out and determine what is safe to document, assessing the safety of the person that you're talking to, and then really reviewing those options and referrals. So it was a screening tool that included this process of making sure that we're doing our due diligence to get folks to safety, to offer resources and referrals to local domestic violence agencies, and really to have those conversations about safety in getting to those resources. And Tonya did a wonderful job of having those individual conversations with survivors when they did identify that there was domestic violence happening in their lives. She did that initial safety planning with them and talked about how to connect with the domestic violence centers and talked about resources that were available to them in the community. And another reason that we decided to use this screening tool is we knew that because of the nature of the Miami community and the Miami State Attorney's Office, there was so many staff and there were so many people that were being trained on this process, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't asking them to, ask 3 pages of questions to survivors. There was already a lot of questions that they were asking as a part of the project and just as a part of their work overall that didn't relate to domestic violence. And so we didn't want to overburden or overwhelm folks that didn't feel comfortable asking that level of questioning. So we did these brief screening tool, and then if domestic violence was identified, then they were referred to Tonya, who's the project coordinator, to then further do that warm referral to domestic violence centers and share information. And I will also say one of the things that we really learned through the screening process is how important it is to not just screen one time, but to have those conversations throughout the process, because it may be that during the intake process, a survivor may not feel safe, or it may not be the right time for them to disclose that. But as they get closer to court or mediation or whatever the next step is, that they may start to get nervous about being in the room with the abuser or what the outcome is going to be, because that person may exert power and control in that situation. And so we continuously asked folks before they were entering different phases of the process, if they felt safe to do that, if they felt safe with that person, if there was any concerns that they had around domestic violence. And that really has benefited the project to be able to have those open conversations with folks and make sure that they feel safe walking through that process. One of the things I wanted to share, I already talked about how Miami has these great community linkages, and it's a huge community strength. And so this was something that we built from. This wasn't something that we had to create from scratch. A lot of these agencies were already working closely together. However, I will say that during the training process, I felt like we really learned that the folks who were doing intake and who were sometimes having these conversations with folks, even though they weren't doing screening, they were just hearing it through their normal intake process, they didn't always have confidence in where to refer survivors. And that was a big piece that that we've continued to talk to folks about and made sure that they had support in that. So Tonya, the on-site coordinator, meets with people, as I said, who disclose domestic violence. And so these intake folks and the folks that work on the call lines really have that on-site support of someone in addition who has a little more time to spend with those folks and connect them to appropriate resources. And we really have received a lot of wonderful feedback from survivors about the way that the project partners have assisted them, both the domestic violence centers that are engaged in the project, as well as the staff of the Child Support Office. So just to sum up my little piece here, some of the things that we learned and continue to learn is that we really need to continue doing training on an ongoing basis, that it shouldn't just be a one-time thing, and that training should be integrated into the orientation of new staff, which is something that happened in Miami and really helped for sustainability. And that support to the staff there should be ongoing and available. And of course, as Michael said earlier, funding does matter, and I recognize that not everybody has this grant right now. And so it was a really good opportunity for us to embark on this relationship and to have funded project partners who are actually working on this. But I am hoping that there are things that folks can draw from the lessons that we've learned in their own work, and as well as we've done the same with other states. We've really learned a lot from other states and other folks who are doing this work. So the other thing I mentioned before was the lessons learned about screening, that we've learned it's really important to screen multiple times in order to ensure safety before court and mediation, and then the documentation pieces around confidentiality and safety, that when we're talking about what's being documented after screening or in the process, if anything at all is being documented about domestic violence, so we always need to have an eye to survivor and their children's safety. That's of utmost importance. And so we learned that lesson and had all of those conversations and continue to have those conversations through the implementation of the project. And we've learned also that the child support agencies and the domestic violence centers can't do this work alone, that we need each other to be able to really fully support survivors. And as a domestic violence advocate, being a part of this project has really taught me a lot about the child support process, and it really helped to be able to effectively safety plan with survivors through when they are getting child support and obtaining these orders. And so that's been a huge benefit to me professionally in working with survivors. I've been grateful for that. And the last thing I wanted to show you all is just a couple of pictures from the Miami State Attorney's Office, the interview room with the Kids Corner. And I mentioned that there's a lot of intake workers and there's a lot of other staff who are talking with folks going through this process. And the State Attorney's Office really wanted to have a space that if someone did disclose domestic violence, that they could then sit down with Tonya and talk a little bit more about what might be helpful to them if they feel safe to move forward with the process, if there's something that they can do to make sure that the process is safe for the survivor. And so they transformed an office that was very, cubicle type desk in it, and put these nice chairs and created this Kids Corner. And one of the things I really liked about the Kids Corner was that they have the little TV with headphones, so that when children are with the parent, they can watch kids shows and videos with the headphones on, and that helps the survivor feel comfortable to have those conversations without thinking that their child's listening to them. And so I thought that was a really neat idea that that others might want to know about. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ann Menard, who will lead the Q&A session with the presenters and with all of you.
Thank you so much, Brandi. Again, this is Ann Menard with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, and we've really had the pleasure of working with Michael and his colleagues at the Office of Child Support Enforcement, as well as many of the state coalitions and even some local programs who have really reached out and built some great collaborations and partnerships with child support agencies, and feel like that's really extending and enhancing the advocacy that they're able to provide for domestic violence survivors. So we have a couple of questions. Michael, I'm going to, one was that Teresa raised about, I just wanted to talk about lessons learned from your wonderful collaborative work with the Texas Council on Family Violence in Texas and in other places in your new federal role. And I'd like to extend her question and ask you to particularly talk about the lessons learned, lessons you've learned about sustaining these collaborations. We're just a couple of years out from a recession where state budgets really collapsed, and we saw, we saw how difficult it was for collaborations in a number of different areas to keep going. So if you could reflect on that. I want to pull out something that Brandi mentioned that I think is a lesson learned from the DV side of things, the domestic violence side of things, is the importance of cross-training. That while we certainly are eager to share what we understand about domestic violence, what we've learned with our child support partners, Brandi mentioned, and this has been my experience as well, that advocates learning more about how child support works, all the details of that, where safety risks might arise within that child support process, and how learning that information can improve our advocacy and safety planning with survivors. So we're not just saying cross-training rhetorically, it really is an important part of these partnerships. So Michael, what would you add about lessons learned?
Sure, thank you so much. Yeah, and thanks, Teresa, for asking this question. So I think one of the and Ann mentioned some work I did with the Texas Council on Family Violence, the statewide coalition there. So during my time in Texas, spent about 7 or 8 years working with the Texas Council and the Texas Child Support Program on building a collaboration. And so one of the key lessons learned is that this needs to be a long-term relationship. So I've jokingly talked about child support and domestic violence coalition partnerships as being kind of like going on a date and then deciding you're going to enter into a long-term relationship. Now, you don't have to get married immediately, but I do think it's important to recognize this is a long-term thing, that it's not just a quote special project from a child support program perspective, that it's really about changing how you do business, or bringing, as Loretta Frederick from the Battered Women's Justice Project says, it's bringing domestic violence smarts to your work. And perhaps an apt analogy is, in the child support program, we translate lots of our materials into Spanish and other languages based upon the populations that we're serving, right? Because we know that we've got to translate materials so that we can provide services to people who have a hard time speaking English and understanding what's going on. Similarly, I think, and when we translate materials, we don't just hand a Spanish language dictionary to some of our staff and say, okay, use the dictionary and translate all of our forms into Spanish. We hire experts who can really help us do a quality job of translating, and maybe not just language, but also some cultural competency. And so I think, similarly from the child support side of things, we should think about that in terms of working on domestic violence. We should bring in the experts to help us improve our services. So I think that's an important lesson. I think another important lesson learned from the work is that it's okay for people to be skeptical. And the example I often give is that when the Texas Child Support Program first wanted to engage and involve domestic violence experts in a review of policies and procedures at the state level, one of the DV experts that was contacted basically responded back and said, "What are you guys up to?" She was very skeptical of our intent and what was planned, and so I think it's okay to be skeptical. And and address that skepticism. And that's part of that long term. It's not just from a child support side of the equation, checking off the domestic violence box. Like, yep, we've talked to the DV advocates, done. I would strongly recommend against that approach. That's not going to be effective, and all it will do is create more skepticism. So think in terms of long term and being willing to seriously reflect on how your operations might be impacting survivors. Recognizing that there may have been things in the past that created increased risk for survivors, and being committed to making changes that are identified by the advocates. Brandi talked a little bit about screening. I think one of the lessons that we learned as well is that there's not just one approach to screening, and in fact, in Texas, the approach that was taken there was based upon some of the learning that's coming out of the medical field and prenatal care. Because for years there was domestic violence questions asked in the prenatal period as the pregnant woman would be in for visits, and over a period of visits, the question there'd be a question about safety in the home or violence in the home, and the answers were oftentimes no. But then the answer, there was this like spike around the into the second trimester, and the question was, well, is that when the violence is happening? Is at the end of the second trimester? But really, what was discovered was that it wasn't that that's when the violence happened. It was just that the survivor felt like that the question had been asked enough that the medical professionals were really serious about wanting to know, and they felt safe and that they could trust that it was okay to disclose then. And so, the lesson we took from that in the Texas Child Support Program was to provide lots of opportunities to disclose, not just one or two screening questions or even a screening instrument at one point in the process, but to have multiple opportunities for survivors to express, that may not be safe at this next step in the process. So thinking about lots of universal information about safety in the child support process, and then opportunities to disclose at any place along the route. That was an important lesson. And then thinking in terms of sustainability, and your question on this. So one of the things that I think is wonderful about the Miami-Dade and the Florida Coalition partnership there is that Miami-Dade reached out and accessed some VOCA funds, some Victims of Crime Act funds, to pay for a DV advocate to be in the child support office and starting in September full time. And so here's an example of identifying another pool of resources and leveraging it to create some ongoing resources and sustainability. Another way of thinking about this is that in the Texas model, and I know recently Indiana did this as well, is using some child support funds or some federal access and visitation grant funds that go to states to fund a contract with a state domestic violence coalition for technical assistance and training. It doesn't have to be a lot of money, but it's a way of helping the coalition build capacity. And all child support programs, we have to do training and work on training resources. And so this is a way of strengthening our training resources for a small investment, but that also helps create some sustainability. It helps the DV Coalition build that capacity to adapt training for child support staff. Because I think the final lesson I'll mention and then pass it back to you, Ann, is that the goal here is not to turn child support workers into DV advocates. The goal here is to turn child support workers into child support workers who know how to handle domestic violence cases in a way that they can safely enforce child support. Just like any other kind of part of our caseload, you have to sometimes adopt new techniques to be able to do your work effectively. And so it's about doing your child support work effectively, having that DV smarts, that new lens on how to work these cases. I'll pass it back to you, Ann.
Yes, thank you so much, Michael. I have a question for Brandi and Ken from the DV side of things, of this partnership. What would you say to a coalition or local program that doesn't feel that they have the resources or time to take on one more issue? And this really goes to the reality facing many domestic violence programs of really stretching very limited resources across all of the different systems or services that domestic violence survivors are trying to access. What is a critical but simple step that every coalition and every program can take to help survivors who want to pursue child support, or very importantly, who are required to engage with child support as a condition of other public benefits that they are seeking? So what would be the first step that you would recommend? Brandi, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, I don't know if it's necessarily a simple step, but I think one of the initial steps that folks could potentially take is developing a referral protocol back and forth between the agencies. I think that was one of the things that was most beneficial to us in starting these partnerships, is to make sure that when domestic violence is identified, that they're able to, whoever's talking with a survivor is able to refer them to a domestic violence center, and vice versa, that the domestic violence center is able to connect them with the appropriate person in the child support office. I think that's a feasible, potentially, first step, although I know that those meetings and that can be quite a process to develop if you're doing a more extensive memorandum of understanding. And the other thing is just really educating ourselves on child support laws. And as Michael said, for child support folks, becoming very domestic violence informed, so that you can effectively work with survivors. And sometimes domestic violence centers and communities have that ability. They have a community education person to do training. Sometimes they don't. And so if that is there, that's something that they're doing already, it may be beneficial to do some of that cross-training with staff, if that's plausible.
Great. Ken, would you add anything? And you may need to unmute yourself if you're talking.
And here I am. Thank you for reminding me of that. I'm just going to dovetail on what Brandi said regarding the cross-referrals, and then also further educating ourselves. State domestic violence coalitions and therefore program advocates would receive the benefit, because the programs are most likely the membership of the coalitions, that coalitions consider building into their core competency training a component on child support. Many are doing components on economic justice, which necessarily include accessing public benefits and child support, but others may not. So this creates critical connections and educational opportunities about that. It's something that coalitions are doing on an ongoing semi-annual or annual basis. So if they don't already have that built into core competency, they could add it. It's something that could become institutionalized within the organization that would benefit all of the domestic violence programs. They could also invite child support staff to be the presenters in the core competency training, which would advance the education of both the child support staff and coalition staff and programs, as well as help to build that network. I would also suggest that coalitions during their membership meetings invite child support staff to share the work that the office does, engage in conversations, if for no other reason than to get to know one another, and attend those meetings, which can get programs and coalitions invited to staff meetings of child support offices, and slowly build from there. Attending meetings often can be challenging, but if you're building, the coalition is building this into their core competency, where the programs are involved and engaged, and child support staff are part of that training, I think there could be some critical connections made there.
And this is Michael.
Yes, go ahead.
Just the thing I'll add there is, I know one of the things that happened in in the Texas experience was that local DV programs would invite child support staff over for like a brown bag lunch, and then that fostered the child support staff to invite the DV staff over for a brown bag lunch at the child support office. Right? So it's very simple, but a way of building kind of understanding of services and being able to make referrals with names and faces, not just, oh, I can send you over to the local DV program or to child support.
Right. I think a theme in all of that last set of recommendations that you made was about relationships. That when we have relationships, we can provide support to survivors in a much more effective and respectful way. So thank you for that. I am going to just acknowledge the excitement that we have that the Office of Child Support Enforcement and the Family Violence Prevention Services Office and the leadership that they're providing to enhance collaborations and connections between child support and domestic violence programs in this new initiative. I think we're going to learn a lot from both in states or communities where collaborations already exist and ways that they've been able to sustain that, but also from newer efforts of child support agencies and domestic violence coalitions or programs that are coming together for the first time and committing to build those collaborations. So we're excited about the learning that's going to emerge from these projects. I want to thank Justine and Michelle, my colleagues back at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, who take care of all the details that are connected with making webinars go as smoothly as they do. There's a lot of moving parts to webinars. So I appreciate their support today. And I'm going to turn it to Ken, who perhaps has some just final comments.
Yes, thank you, Ann. First, I'd like to thank Ann and Michael and Brandi for their great work planning and presenting this webinar. But I think we'd all like to thank Commissioner Turetsky of the Office of Child Support Enforcement and Dr. Mary Louise Kelly, the Director of the Phipps program, for their commitment and leadership shown on the intersections of economic justice and domestic violence. We all know that survivors' ability to navigate the child support system is reliant on our ability to partner with one another and to ensure that systems are responsive to and understand the safety needs of survivors and their children. And that's why we've taken the time today to share this important information and the resources to support all of your efforts. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining. We will be sending you follow-up materials mentioned on the call, as well as information on where the recording of this webinar will be posted. Good luck in your work this month to commemorate Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And with that, just wish everybody to have a great day.